Morning, Seven Marks. How are we doing? Awesome. Good to see you. So, as some of you know, I've talked about this a couple times before. Before I joined the staff here and after I graduated from college, I spent a couple of years as a police officer here in the city of Raleigh, which included a 7-month stint in police academy. As someone growing up, I always really enjoyed school. Are there any other nerds in the room? Those of you who enjoyed school, did pretty well in school? Yeah? I loved learning. I loved taking tests on what I learned. I was kind of wired up for school. And so as someone who's always done really well, it was a hard gear change for me. It was really hard for me to internalize the experience of police academy because so much of what we did, it seemed designed to lead us to a point of failure. Whether it was physically, mentally, emotionally, or whatever. And in a strange way, it's as if the whole point of so many of the things we did was failure. And I'll never forget my first experience with this on our very first day of academy. As so often, on the first day of school, they sent us this long list of supplies and things that we needed to have with us, extra clothes and a notebook and folders and water bottle, all these different kinds of things. And they bring us into this big room with all of our stuff and line us up for our very first inspection. And one by one down the list they go, asking us if you have your extra shirts, do you have your folders, do you have your water bottle? And we have to dig through our bag, find the thing that they're asking for, and hold it high above our heads to show we have it. And if you can't find it fast enough, or if you don't have it at all, then everybody's doing mountain climbers or push-ups or something like that. Now, as far as it goes, nothing on this list was that heavy. They were all pretty small items. But you hold anything over your head long enough and it can start to feel heavy. And that's about where I was when they told us to find the padlock for our lockers. So dug through my bag and found it, pulled it out and held it high above my head like this, and my shoulder was on fire. And so I'm standing there, like stressing out of my mind. I'm looking around to see if any of the academy staff is paying attention. And all of a sudden, I just do this right here, switch arms. Nobody will notice. Someone immediately noticed. And in my face, yelling at me, yeah, nobody saw that, right? Pathetic. How are you ever going to make it through this process if you can't even hold up a padlock? Hey, everybody, this one's going to be done by the end of the week. I'm just standing there, and I was mortified. It's a humbling thing when you're defeated by something that weighs less than a pound and then immediately dragged in front of all of your peers by your supervisors. I didn't get a lot of sleep that night. That experience and those words, they rattled around in my head pretty relentlessly. And I'll tell you that story for a couple of reasons today. The second of which we'll come to in a few minutes. But the first is because that's not a perfect metaphor, but it's an appropriate metaphor, I think, for how I have felt about this series that we began last week called Fuel for Life. And so if you were here, you watched online, or if you caught up over the last week, we began a series on the practice, our fall series on the practice of silence and solitude. And we defined it pretty simply. We said silence is the practice of temporarily withdrawing in order to listen and hear from God. Pastor Paul did a great job last week of taking us throughout the life and ministry of Jesus and showing us these little snapshots and how it just seemed to be an important part of the rhythm of Jesus' life, that he made space to get away from it all, to be alone with his Father. And the challenge last week was really simple. Go out of here and practice the way of Jesus. Pick a time, pick a place, set a modest goal, and then go for it. And on the surface, doesn't that sound so easy? What? You just want me to leave here and go and be quiet for a few minutes and wait for God? That's not so heavy. That's not so hard. I can do that. But honesty time. How many of you, if you even remembered to do it at all last week, how many of you were surprised at just how heavy doing nothing can be? Just how hard it can be to be still for a few minutes. How many of you were surprised at just how difficult it can be to do nothing at all but wait for God? And that's kind of what I want us to talk about in our time together this morning. Because I think you should take the practices of silence and solitude really seriously. But you should know that if you're going to do that, you need to expect a lot of challenge and resistance from at least two sources that we'll talk about today. The first is external resistance, and the second, obviously, is internal resistance. So let's talk about both in turn. The first is the external challenges that we face. Now, I think we would basically run out of time today if I tried to name every challenge that you're going to encounter in your life towards this practice. But here's a few honorable mentions. The first challenge we all face is our pace of life. I don't know if you have noticed this or not, but modern culture is a bit of a metaphysical disaster. We are grafted into a story from the earliest of ages which says the most important thing about you is what you achieve, how high up the ladder you can climb, how much you can accumulate for yourself, how much you can produce, how great of a name you can make for yourself. And yet, the words that most people use to describe their lives are tired and busy. Tired and busy. Did you know that we walk faster, talk faster, and work longer than people did just a generation or two ago? Did you know that only 56% of Americans don't even take 1 week of vacation anymore? 40% of Americans are in the category of what we would call chronically sleep deprived. Johan Ari, in his great book, Stolen Focus, I think he captures it well. He says, most of us experience life as a kind of paradox. Many of the things we need to do are so obvious that they are banal. Slow down, do one thing at a time, sleep more. Really easy. But even though at some level we all know them to be true, we are in fact moving in the opposite direction, towards more speed, more switching, less sleep. We live in a gap between what we know we should do and what we feel we can do. You know that gap he's talking about? This brings us to our second challenge, which is distractions. You know, if we lived even 100 years ago, a series on the importance of making time for silence and solitude would be kind of ridiculous because you would have plenty of both, whether you wanted it or not. But that's not our moment anymore. We have too many choices, too many options, too many things to distract us. We've got places to go, things to do, groceries to buy, kids to get to practice. We've got work to deal with. We've got hobbies. We've got shows to watch. We've got books to read. Well, we don't really read books anymore, but we have movies based on books that we need to read. We have fantasy football lineups to get done by 1 o'clock, and your kid's school has emailed you 3 times since I started talking. I live in that world too, and I know what it's like. A couple weeks ago, I had to go to Costco to get a bunch of stuff for our house, and it was a busy time, which is to say it was during their normal business hours. So I knew I was going to be in there for a while, which is no big deal because I had a couple of podcasts that I wanted to catch up on. So I'm walking into the store, grab my cart, pull out my AirPods case, flip it open, and it's empty. And I am really glad that none of you were here or there to see how I responded in that moment. I'm really glad you couldn't read my thoughts in that moment because I was furious. An hour or more in Costco without something to listen to? I mean, is this persecution? Like, what am I supposed to do for the next hour? And the worst part about it, besides my response, my attitude towards it, is the reason I didn't have my headphones is because they were twisted up in the sheets at home somewhere. I'd fallen asleep the night before listening to an audiobook. Because like you, I can easily fill my life full of distractions. Which brings me to the third thing, the third obstacle that we all face externally, which is technology. The increasingly central role that technology, especially our phones, play in our lives. In his book, Digital Minimalism, Cal Newport writes that you and I, we are the first people who have ever lived that can actually choose to live in complete solitude deprivation. That's his term for it. And he writes this. He says, the smartphone provided a new technique to banish the last remaining slivers of solitude. The quick glance. At the slightest hint of boredom, you can now surreptitiously glance at any number of apps or mobile-adapted websites that have been optimized to provide you an immediate and satisfying dose of input from other minds. Our phones increasingly dictate our rhythms, our thinking, our feeling, our schedules, and most of the aspects of our lives. But I was reminded recently that it has not always been that way. When Steve Jobs first introduced the iPhone in 2007, the major talking point was that we would no longer have to carry around 3 devices: a music player, a mobile phone, and an internet communicator, is what he called it. Great! But how's that going for us? Today, depending on where you get your data from, the average person looks at their screens for 3.5 to 6 hours a day. That number doubles if you're talking about adolescents and teens. We pick up our phones nearly 100 times a day, and we touch our screens over 2,600 times a day. For good reason, I think. Did Tony Fadell, the co-creator of iPhone, once say, "I wake up in cold sweats every so often thinking, what did we bring to the world?" Indeed. All of which is to say, if you're going to take the practices of silence and solitude seriously, you need to get ready to swim against the stream of our cultural moment. In other words, you need to be prepared. You will almost certainly have to adjust your pace, reduce your distractions, and change your relationship to technology, especially your phone. But let's say you do that. Let's say you want time with your Heavenly Father so bad that you do all of that. Well, then you should know that it's only the beginning, because then we have to face the internal challenges. So the truth is that many of us, we live at an impossible pace, and we give ourselves over to distractions and technology because we prefer it to the silence. Many of us have disordered schedules because we don't know how else to be. Many of us have disordered relationships with our phones because we don't know what to do with ourselves when we put them down. I was interested to learn in some of the reading and research for this series that scientists who study the brain have been increasingly interested in the last few years in what our minds are doing, what our brains are doing when we're not doing anything at all, when we're not given to a task, when we're not giving our attention to anything at all in particular. And it turns out our brains are doing quite a lot, actually. There are regions of your brain that only activate when you're not giving your attention to anything. They call it the default network. And it does a lot of different things for us, but for our purposes today, I think the most interesting thing about the default network is when it's active, we tend to naturally drift into reflections about our social lives. And I was reading this, and I thought, this is the coolest thing to me. It's as if we were made for the practices of silence and solitude. It's as if God has wired us up in such a way that one of the most life-giving and essential practices for transformation is literally as simple as stopping for a few moments, quieting all of the noise around you, and just being still. And if you can do that, your mind will almost effortlessly lead you into reflecting on the quality and condition of your life, your relationships, and your trust in God. The problem, of course, is that one of the things that we don't ever want to think about is the quality and condition of our life and our relationships. Henry Nouwen hauntingly observes, solitude is not the private therapeutic place. In solitude, I get rid of my scaffolding. No friends to talk with, no telephone calls to make, no meetings to attend, no music to entertain, no books to distract. Just me. Naked, vulnerable, weak, sinful, deprived, broken. Nothing. It is this nothingness that I have to face in my solitude. And nothing is so dreadful that everything in me wants to run to my friends, my work, my distractions, so that I can forget my nothingness and make myself believe that I am worth something. The task then is to persevere, he says, in my solitude, to stay in my cell until my seductive visitors get tired of pounding on the door and leave me alone. The struggle is real because the danger is real. The danger of living the whole of our life as one long defense against the reality of our condition. All of which is to say, if you're going to take silence and solitude seriously, get ready for internal resistance. You'll be surprised at times at how inadequate you feel, how hard an easy thing can actually be. You'll wonder if you have what it takes. You'll wonder if you're strong enough. You'll wonder if you're doing it right or if you're getting anything out of it. And then, if you persevere, you'll have to deal with difficult emotions. Perhaps the first will be exhaustion. And of course, when you finally adjust your pace, your body will respond. But then you may have to deal with things like worry, fear, or anxiety as you reflect on those parts of your life that you try really hard not to think too much about. You may be surprised to discover anger or bitterness, hatred, as you suddenly start reflecting on a relational issue or a past wound that you haven't dealt with yet. You may be surprised that you're just not as far along in life with God as you thought you were. In the silence, you may discover that there's not as much between you and your Heavenly Father as you hoped there was. There are a lot of uncomfortable and disconcerting things that we can discover in the silence about ourselves. It is not an easy place. Now, having sufficiently discouraged you from ever trying to do silence and solitude in your life, let me see if I can pivot a little bit. And let's return to the padlock. So there I was in my early 20s in an environment that seemed designed to set me up for failure. And thanks to this little padlock, or one just like it, I had to face some uncomfortable and incomplete things about myself. But with the benefit of hindsight and years to think about this, it has occurred to me. Nobody cared how long I could hold a padlock over my head. That wasn't what was important in that moment. They were deeply interested, though, in how I responded to the crisis that the moment created. That's why they set us up for failure. It's a test to see if I really want to be there or not, to see if I'm really willing to stick it out or not, to see if I'll keep showing up for my peers on those tough days or not, to see if I'm the kind of person who is willing to endure long enough to be changed by the process. Sometimes the test is not about passing or failing. Sometimes the whole point of the test is to expose you so that you can begin to be transformed. So enough about the challenges. Let's talk transformation now. Why should you embrace this practice? Why should you put in the effort to cultivate this? And why should you endure, though you will experience resistance and challenge? Well, to answer those questions, I would love for you to join me in the scriptures today. We're going to be in two places, actually, Psalm 78 first, and then we'll jump over to Deuteronomy chapter 8. Feel free to pull them up both in your text or on your phone. We'll have them on the screen if you need it. And while you're locating that, let me just set a little bit of context for the passage. So last week, as I said a few moments ago, Pastor Paul did a great job of showing us these snapshots, right, in the life of Jesus, and how it was just an important habit of his to cultivate silence and solitude, to be alone with the Father. And last week we taught you a Greek word, didn't we, that you perhaps didn't know before, eremos. It's a Greek word that's used over and over again to describe where Jesus goes and what he's doing during this practice. And it's a word that simply means desolate place, desert, or wilderness. It's as if Jesus had this habit, whether it was for a few minutes early in the dark of the morning, or after a long day of ministry, sometimes all night, and once for 40 days. It seems that Jesus was just in this habit of cultivating wilderness moments throughout his life. And my question is, why did he do that? Where did Jesus get the idea that a really important part of life with God is time spent in the wilderness? Well, as we talked about earlier this year in our series on the covenants, Jesus was the kind of person whose heart and mind, they were saturated with the stories and the themes and the ideas of the Hebrew Bible, which we call the Old Testament. And if you have any church background at all, Bible background at all, then you probably know that there's a wilderness story in the Old Testament that is so central and so important that it basically sets all of the categories you need to understand what the wilderness means in the biblical imagination, including its ongoing significance for us today. I'm talking, of course, about the 40 years that Israel spends wandering in the wilderness between leaving Egypt and entering into the promised land. Now, this wilderness story, it takes up most of the first 5 books of the Bible, so we don't have anything like the time to unpack it in detail. But the good news is we don't have to, because we have Psalm 78, which is a poetic retelling of the national history of the story of Israel. It's a long psalm, so I don't have time to read it all, but I just want to read some excerpts over you, and it'll set us up for where we're going in Deuteronomy chapter 8. So let's begin Psalm 78, verse 1. Give ear, O my people, to my teaching. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth now in a parable. I will utter dark sayings from of old, things that we have heard and known that our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from their children, but tell them to the coming generation the glorious deeds of the Lord and his might and his wonders that he has done. He established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers to teach their children, that the next generation might know him as well, the children yet unborn, and that they would arise and tell their children as well, so that they should set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments, and that they should not be like their fathers were. Their fathers were stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation whose heart was not steadfast, whose spirit was not faithful to God. So there you go, Psalm 78. Here, the context is, this is a psalm encouraging God's people to keep sharing the story of their history, because it's the story and the record of God's faithfulness. Keep telling the next generation about God. That's how this thing keeps going. And the structure, the content of Psalm 78 actually helps you do that. It tells the story of Israel. Let's jump down to verse 12. Speaking of that previous generation who was faithless, in the sight of their fathers, God performed wonders in the land of Egypt. This is the story of Exodus, in the fields of Zoan. He divided the sea and let them pass through it, and he made water stand like a heap. In the daytime, he led them with a cloud, and all the night with a fiery light. God split rocks in the wilderness and gave them drink abundantly as from the deep. He made streams come out of the rock and caused waters to flow down like rivers. God created Eden right there in the wilderness for his people. Yet they sinned still more against him, rebelling against the Most High in the desert. They tested God in their heart by demanding the food they craved. They spoke against God saying, God can God spread a table in the wilderness? I know he struck a rock so that water gushed and the streams overflowed, but come on. Can he also give bread and provide meat for his people? Therefore, when the Lord heard, he was full of wrath. A fire was kindled against Jacob. His anger rose against Israel because they did not believe in God and they did not trust his saving power. Yet he commanded the skies above and opened the doors of heaven. He rained down on them manna to eat and gave them bread from heaven. And you'll never believe what happened. Right there in the desert, man ate the bread of the angels. He sent them food in abundance. He caused the east wind to blow in the heavens. And by his power, he let out the south wind. He rained meat on them like dust, winged bird like sand of the seas. He let them fall in the midst of their camp, all around their dwellings. And they ate and were filled, for he gave them what they craved. And jump down to verse 32. In spite of all of this, they still sinned. Despite his wonders, they did not believe. And let's finish up with verse 38 and following. Yet he, being compassionate as he always is, he atoned for their iniquity and did not destroy them. He restrained his anger often and did not stir up all of his wrath. And you know why? Do you know why God did that for them in the desert? Well, he remembered that they were but flesh, a wind that passes and comes not again. How often they rebelled against him in the wilderness and grieved him in the desert. They tested God again and again, and they provoked the Holy One of Israel. They did not remember his power or the day when he redeemed them from the foe. When he performed signs in Egypt and his marvels in the fields of Zoan. Psalm 78. Again, we don't have time to read the whole thing, but two things that I want to draw to your attention here. First is just notice how important the experience of the 40 years in the wilderness is to Israel. It frames their whole understanding of themselves hundreds of years later in this psalm. But the second thing is, this psalm helps key us into why the wilderness was such a significant experience for Israel in the first place. You see, the wilderness, it reveals what you are made of. What you're really like, it comes out in the wilderness. But it's also true that the wilderness is the place where you are prepared for what you were made for. It's a test. That's what it is. Which brings us now to Deuteronomy chapter 8. So if Psalm 78 is the view from 30,000 feet, then Deuteronomy is the view from 10,000 feet. We're getting a little bit closer to the ground here. And Moses, this is now him at the end of his life. This is the end of the 40 years in the wilderness, and he's speaking to the next generation. He's about to die, and they are about to go into the promised land. And among many other things, Moses says this to them, Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 1. The whole commandment that I command you today, you shall be careful to do, that you may live and multiply and go in and possess the land that the Lord swore to give your fathers. And you shall remember the whole way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, that he might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. And he humbled you, and he let you hunger, and then he fed you with manna, which you didn't know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know something else, that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of God. Jesus quotes this in the New Testament. We're going to come back to that in a few weeks. Know then in your heart that as a man disciplines his son, the Lord your God disciplines you. So you shall keep the commandments of the Lord your God by walking in his ways and by fearing him. The wilderness exposed us for what we're really like. But you know why that happened? Because of this. You see, for the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land of brooks of water, fountains and springs flowing out into the valleys and hills. A land of wheat and barley, of vines and fig trees and pomegranates, of olive trees and honey, a land in which you will eat bread without scarcity, in which you will lack nothing. A land whose stones are iron and out of whose hills you can dig copper. And you shall eat and be full, and you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land that he has given you. The wilderness reveals what you are, but it also prepares you for what you were made for. And here's Moses now at the end of his life, looking out at the children of Israel after this terrible experience in the desert. And he says, you know what? That was like the best thing that ever happened to us. Gosh, we really needed that. Because you know what? It turns out the wilderness revealed that we didn't love God nearly as much as we said we did. We were not prepared to be faithful like we promised we were at Mount Sinai. We did not trust God like we thought we would. He may have brought us out of Egypt, but it turns out the wilderness showed us that there's a lot more of Egypt within us than we recognized. The wilderness brought us face to face with the depravity and the depth of our sin. And in the wilderness, you know what else we discovered? That God is faithful every step of the way. And that he is preparing us through the wilderness for the promised land. Dan Allender, psychologist, he helps us see that the Israel experience is not just unique to them. It is, in a sense, what we all must encounter. He says, our spiritual journey must lead through the desert, or else our healing will be the product of our own will and wisdom. It is in the silence of the desert that we hear our dependence on noise. It is in the poverty of the desert that we see clearly our attachments to the trinkets and baubles we cling to for security and pleasure. The desert shatters the soul's arrogance and leaves body and soul crying out in thirst and hunger. In the desert, we trust God or die. The wilderness is an environment that is engineered to bring about failure. It is a place that teaches us by taking everything away. It is a test so that we can discover the quality and condition of our lives and our relationships and our trust in God. And it is in that place that we are forged into the kinds of people who can genuinely and authentically enjoy life with God. So what does all of this talk about the wilderness have to do with the practices of silence and solitude? Everything, actually. You see, if the wilderness is about self-discovery and life transformation, then here's something you should know. You don't have to wait for your life circumstances to completely fall apart to end up in the wilderness. You don't have to wait, nor should you wait for God to drag you there against your will. Like Jesus, you can learn to cultivate little wilderness moments throughout the course of your life. That's what these practices are all about. It is literally as simple as ceasing all of the external noises of your life and circumstances and quieting all of the noise inside your heart and mind. And when you can do that and you find yourself there in the silence, well, there you are, finally alone. But not all alone, for you are in the presence of your Father. And you are finally able to listen to your life in the presence of the Spirit. Last week, we challenged you pretty simply. Like Jesus, pick a time, pick a place, set a modest goal, and then go for it. And so as we conclude our time together today, I just want to add one small thing to it, one small challenge. Just whatever you did last week, just add something to it. So, if you didn't do anything at all, if you forgot about this, you didn't practice it at all, no big deal. Give it a shot this week. If it was 2 days, why not try 4 days? If it was for 5 minutes, why not 10 minutes? Just one small step towards cultivating something like a sustainable habit in your life. For me right now, the goal is 10 minutes a day. My mornings usually begin, my current rhythm at least, is to begin the day reading the scriptures a little bit, praying for a little while. If I have some time, I read something else that's spiritually nourishing from my shelf. But then before I get up and begin the day, I try to make a little time for the wilderness. Recently, I've been helped by an app on my phone, technology's not all bad, called Centering Prayer. And it's basically a timer app for silence and solitude. So before you begin, it gives you 4 simple directions. Step 1, pick a word, a phrase, some kind of symbol that will help kind of guide your mind to reflecting on God. For me, that's whatever I read in my quiet time. If there's a theme or a verse or some kind of idea, something that sticks out about God to me, I'll kind of bring that with me into the beginning of silence to orient me. Step 2 is find yourself in a comfortable place. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and prepare for what's about to happen. Step 3 is if you find yourself drifting, if you get stuck thinking about something, if you loop in on your grocery list and can't stop thinking about it or whatever, use your word, your phrase, your symbol, whatever it is to draw your mind, your heart back to God. And when the time is up, step 4, don't rush. Don't rush out of the moment, even after it's over. So when I begin, a little bell goes off to let me know to get started. And when I conclude, another little bell goes off to tell me time's up. It's just 10 minutes. Sometimes I do more. Sometimes I do less. Sometimes not at all. But 10 minutes, that is a reasonable, sustainable goal for me in this season of my life. That's 70 minutes a week. If I got it perfect, that's 70 minutes a week. 60 hours a year in the wilderness with my Heavenly Father. Gosh, what could 60 hours a year do to my trust in my Heavenly Father and my affection for Him and my character formation and my capacity to love others well? Of course, most weeks I do not get it perfectly right. I miss. I don't want to do it. But that's okay, because perfection is not the point. In fact, I don't even know what perfection would look like with a practice like this. All the great masters and teachers of this, they say something similar. Resist the urge to judge the experience by any kind of utilitarian metrics. In other words, the moment you start asking yourself questions like, is this fun? Am I getting anything out of this? Am I doing it right? Is it worth it? Man, you are in danger. You are in danger of completely missing the entire point of what we're talking about here. Ruth Haley Barton sums it up so well. She says, the invitation to solitude and silence is an invitation to enter more deeply into the intimacy of relationship with the one who waits just outside the noise and busyness of our lives. It is an invitation to communication and communion with the one who is always present, even when our awareness has been dulled by distraction. It is an invitation to the adventure of spiritual formation in the deepest places of our being, an adventure that will result eventually in greater freedom and authenticity and surrender to God than we have yet experienced. My prayer has been and is for you this week that you will find yourself at some point in the wilderness by choice. Yeah, it's a test. It's a challenge. There is resistance, but it is also the place of transformation. And you know what? Your heavenly Father will be with you every step of the way.